In the 1970s and 1980s, the Jesuits had found themselves embroiled, or rather openly supporting, various condemned movements in Central and South America. These would be the political movements in opposition to right-wing dictators. These would be movements like Sandinistas and other hard left-wing movements, all steeped in liberation theology. You'd see Catholic priests picking up weapons to physically resist and fight back against these political leaders who were not good men by any stretch of the imagination. But seeing Catholic priests pick up arms was a little much for the papacy. And so things came to a head. We now turn to Father Malachi Martin, and returning for the first time in several months to his work, The Jesuits. He outlines the section that comes before what I read here for you, the heinousness of Central and South America in the 1970s and the inappropriate relationship between the Jesuits and the various resistance movements at the time. Eventually, he tells us, word got back to Rome, and Pope John Paul II, as you might expect, didn't take kindly to what the Jesuits had become. We now continue with Malachi Martin on the Jesuits. Father General Arupe, head of the Jesuits, was informed by the Pope that the Society of Jesus needed thorough reform in its theologians, in its writers, in its social activists, in its method of training Jesuit candidates, in its colleges, universities, and institutes of higher learning, in its missionary methods in Africa and Asia, in its parishes, and its social apostolate. In fact, throughout, from top to bottom in the society, reform and house cleaning were imperative. Father Arupe's own usefulness as general was also represented as nearing 0 point. Of course, Holy Father was the essence of Arupe's dutiful answer, but according to the Jesuit constitutions, which several of His Holiness's predecessors on this blessed throne of Peter had approved and confirmed many times over the centuries, such reform could only be carried out in a normal and juridically correct manner by a general congregation of Jesuit leaders from all over the world, gathered at the Gesu in Rome with their Father General, with the permission of the Holy Father, of course. The Father General and his colleagues would need at least a year, it usually took 15 months, in order to prepare adequately for such an important general congregation. John Paul's answer was unhesitating: convoke the general congregation, and prepare for it well. The problem had to be solved. There was no further word at that moment about ending Arupe's term as general. As of April 1980, the same busy month in which the Sandinistas were visiting the Vatican Secretary of State and the Nicaraguan bishops were visiting the pontiff, Father General Arupe notified all the provinces of the society throughout the world that a general congregation would be held the following year, or at the latest in 1982. Preparation in the provinces was to begin immediately. Actually, at this stage of struggle, Arupe was near the end of his tether. He had run out of options for eluding papal efforts at controlling the society. In large part, his society appeared to be beyond recall to its due order, even by a pope. Arupe was the best man placed to recognize this. He had presided over the growing and now irreducible lump of resistance by Jesuits to John Paul II. Well-founded Vatican rumor had it that John Paul was going to remove him from the generalate as a start in the right direction. God alone knew what that direction was. Arupe was tired. In the course of a 10-minute meeting granted him in August of 1980, Arupe inquired if the Holy Father wished him to resign his post as Jesuit general. No, was the Pope's brusque answer. John Paul did not say so in so many words, but he had made up his mind that he himself should keep the initiative in his hands rather than appoint a successor or caretaker to carry on independently in the general's place. Nor had the Pope any intention of letting Father General Arupe escape so lightly from the mess he had created over his 15 years at the helm of the society. The Holy Father, Arupe was informed, was not talking about the simple resignation of one man. What was at issue was the nature and function of the whole society, as the Pope's militia. There were many possibilities. The status of the society could be changed. The draft text of the Church's latest version of canon law was in its final stages. One small paragraph in it would suffice to deprive the Society of Jesus of all of its privileges in the Church and of its special status in relation to the papacy. It could be reduced to the rank of an ordinary diocesan congregation governed locally by single bishops. There were still other and more drastic possibilities. It might be necessary to suppress the society, at least for a time, and perhaps reconstitute it later according to its original principles. Certain more traditional-minded Jesuits had in fact already petitioned Rome to do just that. The unremittingly ominous tenor of this papal answer was not lost on Arupe, but to be certain the matter was clear to the Jesuit. His allies in the Vatican Secretary of State explained the fundamental cause of the Pope's dissatisfaction to the Father General. In the Holy Father's strategy, bent to cope with Marxism as the threat, the Jesuits were the greatest obstacle, and they were the greatest consolation of His Holiness's enemies. Like it or not, that was fact. Ostensibly to clear his own record as general and to demonstrate that all Jesuits were alerted in the proper fashion, and so to repudiate any thought of official Jesuit approval for Marxism, in December of 1980, Father Arupe composed, but, in circumstances curiously, delayed publishing a letter on the subject of Marxism which could be interpreted in an orthodox way. Jesuit Father General Pedro Arupe, on the other hand, did not seem to be able to complete the preparations for the general congregation of the Jesuits, nor did he seem somehow to get Fernando Cardenal in order. Rather, Cardenal, like the Pope, toured widely. He made his abilities, his imposing presence, and his political and ideological viewpoints clear to North American audiences on his lecture tour, mainly around the circuit of Jesuit campuses. So appealing and publicized a Sandinista spokesman he had become, in spite of John Paul's repeated admonitions to Arupe that in 1981, while his Pope was constantly delivering a totally different message and working for a totally opposed goal, Fernando Cardenal was delighted to receive a nomination for the Nobel Peace Prize from 133 members of the British House of Parliament and the European Parliament combined. Fernando Cardenal was not the only Jesuit Arupe seemed unable to control, nor were Nicaraguan Jesuits alone in their continuing organized corporate disobedience. Jesuits in Latin America, North America, Europe, everywhere, it sometimes seemed, were sniping with carefree abandon at John Paul's social teaching and religious doctrine. There were continual streams of complaints arriving at the papal office, all detailing the unorthodox opinions being taught by Jesuits in Europe and the United States. There were, in addition, revelations that certain circles in the international section of the stonecutter houses in Europe and Latin America were actively organizing opposition to the pontiff in Poland, that Vatican prelates, some 20 in all, were formal members of the Italian Lodge, and that once again Arupe's Jesuits seemed involved with lodge circles opposed to the pontiff. Paul VI already had, in 1965, warned Arupe and the delegates to the 31st General Jesuit Congregation of the dangers in belonging to the compact. It began to appear to John Paul that the warning had not been too wide of the mark. Some of John Paul II's most trusted advisors began urging him to wait no longer for Arupe to act. There was too much at stake to allow the runaway Jesuit leaders to continue pillaging papal strategy, papal authority, and this pope's clearly stated orders. Tempted though the Holy Father may have been to follow that advice, the problem was then and still is that to do so be like shooting himself in the foot. Very likely, given the prestige of the Jesuits and the widespread rebellion against the papacy, to take unilateral action against Arupe and his Jesuits could provoke repercussions that could damage his own papal policies and perhaps damage the Church. For one thing, precisely because of the blatant Marxist outlook and Moscow ties of the Jesuits in Nicaragua in particular, unless the forced withdrawal of the priests in the Nicaraguan government were neatly done, it might be taken as an overt violation of that secret pact formed nearly 20 years before between the Moscow Politburo and the Vatican. Furthermore, because the observance of that pact and all its implications was Agostino Cardinal Casaroli's guiding principle as Secretary of State, Casaroli might well resign his post at the Secretariat in open protest. In that case, John Paul would lose an important player in the hot and cold diplomacy, the carrot-and-stick policy he practiced vis-a-vis the Soviets. Meanwhile, the Vatican protocol would still leave Cardinal Casaroli with considerable influence and power and somewhat less constraint if he removed himself or removed from his post. In addition to all of this, at this still early stage of his pontificate, as he realized full well, John Paul did not know who in the Vatican Secretariat and the entire bureaucracy was really on his side, nor how many within the system had been acquired by Moscow directly or indirectly. It was, in other words, the wrong time for any scarifying action that touched the Soviet Union. John Paul's plans for solidarity in Poland were maturing. The Soviets knew of them, did not approve or disapprove of them, but were waiting to see the clear outlines of the game, the nature of the quid pro quo John Paul could and would offer. That may have sounded like a lot of politics, but that's the point. Why didn't John Paul II suppress the Jesuits? It was because of politics. International politics, with the Great Bear of the East on the other side of the now non-existent Iron Curtain. He feared repercussions. The Jesuits were practically their own entity. It's why I generally call them the Jesuit Church. They are, for all intents and purposes, their own church. They are practically in schism with Rome. They certainly are in schism with the faith. At least the modern Jesuit church type Jesuits, not certainly the handful of good Jesuits that remain. There would be repercussions if they were suppressed at that time. But that begs a question. That all ceased to be a concern right around 1990. Why didn't John Paul II in, say, 1995 suppress the Jesuits? Because they still had international prestige. I would even go so far as to say that they had friends in Washington. After all, we know that there was a Catholic Spring attempted. We know from emails from 2013 that tell us as much. And we know men like Ted McCarrick, maybe not in 1980, but certainly by 1995, were rubbing shoulders with the power elite in Washington. Certainly he was not a Jesuit. But you have to ask yourself, men like Ted McCarrick, what kind of connections did he have? Would he have protected the Jesuits? And I say yes, he would have. Their goals were one and the same. I'm curious what you think of this. Let me know in the comments, please. Like and subscribe if you haven't. It does help. Sharing this on social media helps a lot too. Today's reading was taken from Malachi Martin's The Jesuits. So always pray for the church. I'm Anthony Stine. Ave Maria.